Spurwade Houchins, and this is about psychotronic harassment and V2K communications. And what we had here specifically in Clark County during an operation called Operation Icebreaker. And I was part of Operation Icebreaker as a low-level drug user at the time back in 2016. It's now 2019. And during this period of time, law enforcement used psychotronic weaponry and V2K communications, transformational optics, and several other types of psychological operational tactics to taint and torment people in the public during a large-scale investigation involving local, state, and federal authorities. Also at this time, A&E series Live PD was launched about the same time, and in the contractual agreement that they had with the local government here, they were allowed to involve themselves in operations and investigations without limitations. Again, they had people in the entertainment industry with Live PD that were allowed to involve themselves in operations and investigations without limitations. Now, operations are highly classified, and so are investigations. I don't know how someone from the entertainment industry could involve themselves without limitations in those things, but that's what happened here. And we're not really focused on that at this point, but we are focused on V2K communications and the dangers of V2K communications and psychotronic weaponry and how it can have an effect on the community. And that's exactly what it had here. It had a very negative impact, especially on myself. To give you a little bit of background, this is a government family home, so my father did 27 years in the military, and then he worked for the VA, the Veterans Hospital over in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm in southern Indiana, in Clark County, Indiana, in Jeffersonville, very small little town right outside of metropolitan area over in Louisville, Kentucky. We are on the border by the Ohio River, and there's approximately 6 miles from here to Louisville. On the Indiana side, you're in the Midwest. If you cross that 6 mile threshold and cross the bridge, you're in a different state, you're in the Commonwealth, and you're actually officially in the South. So it's kind of an interesting little area referred to a lot as Kentuckiana. So what we had here was we had a group of individuals that were using psychotronic weaponry in a psychological operation. If you're not familiar with psychotronic weaponry, it is a combination of both psychological and electronic is the combination of the words. And you should pick up a copy of Michael F. Bell's The Invisible Crime. It is a very interesting, there's part 1 and part 2. It's a very interesting piece of work on that type of equipment, that type of harassment, and a true life story about what you can encounter. Some of the stories that I've seen in my research can get a bit far-fetched, but this guy is an author, so he compiled a pretty good piece of literature, very easy read, very easy to understand. And V2K communications, for anyone who doesn't know, is voice-to-skull communications. It's a type of technology. It was developed back in the 60s or some shit, and it literally sounds as if a voice is inside of your skull. Not schizophrenic, not crazy. This is a technology that there are unclassified documents released that a scientist had successfully done it back in the 60s. So it's been around for a while. So they really started to work on this weaponry when they were looking at third world countries and going overseas in psychological operations and using psychotronic weaponry. It is a weapon. There's several things that are considered acoustic weapons, and V2K is an acoustic weapon. Very much like a taser is a weapon, but it's a non-lethal weapon. V2K is a acoustic weapon. And so what they did here, this basic demographic area is mostly Christian and Christian demographics. So what they did was they used transformational optics. And transformational optics is a little harder for me to explain to you, but it is much like a shadow in a sense, that it can be projected in a form to make things appear not always what they seem. Much like a magician and an illusion. If there's you've seen people with card tricks or people who make things looks like their little thumbs coming off and their thumbs not coming off. It's an illusion. Transformational optics that they used here involved a very high level of technology, federal technology. So they went out through this operation. It was supposed to be for a drug sting. I was a low-level user at the time, approximately about every 6 weeks, using amphetamine about maybe every 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, maybe a half a gram, quarter gram, no more. And at this point, it's been 3 years later. I'm clean and sober. I've gotten away from those things. But even at this time, I was nothing more than a low-level user. I stay at this house, which my father owns, and was staying here rent-free and working a job. So what they did was they sent a confidential informant in to try to, set me up for some reason. They kind of target the guy who has a job or whatever. And there was some officers that were having sexual relations with this confidential informant. She and I engaged in copulation as well. And there was, since that point, there became an ongoing great degree of V2K communications. Now, in my past, I've been in other major areas and I've encountered V2K communications and how it has been handled appropriately, how it was effectively used in the field in a federal operation or a federal activated drill or an activated high alert. Really, it wasn't a drill. And a couple high alert situations where V2K communications were necessary. And in those high alert situations that I encountered with federal authorities, they were able to use the technology for what the bureaucratical individuals released that for. So they're allowed to use psychotronic weaponry in the quote-unquote war on drugs. I don't really want to get too far into why that is the way it is, because it won't make any sense. But I can tell you they can use this type of technology along with the DEA in any type of operations. And there needs to be a little bit more mandate and a little bit more overseeing about what goes on. And I'll tell you exactly why. I've been in areas where they've used this type of technology to gather intelligence, and it's been used on me, and it was used very effectively, very appropriately, very occupationally appropriately, very professionally, very polished, finished very well, and you don't even really know what happened. Something was different. You can't tell what was going on. I thought it was a Bluetooth. I said, how do these motherfuckers got a Bluetooth in here somehow? I couldn't figure out what it was. And that's the way it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to be able to identify it. So it was used very effectively. Now, in Operation Icebreaker and post-Operation Icebreaker, it was a little different. In Clark County, Indiana, when they launched this operation, and think about it, Icebreaker, breaking the ice. It wasn't about ice as amphetamine. They were setting out to do things that they probably shouldn't have been doing with V2K communications and psychotronic weaponry at the time. So they went around, and part of the tactics are to get a person to do something humanly demoralizing, something they'll never tell another human being. And they used transformational optics here at my father's residence that I was residing in. I live here alone, just me and the dog. And I did at the time. I'm blessed that my father allows me to do so. I think he was like grade 12, grade 13 on the government scale. He was a master sergeant in the United States Army. Again, I told you he worked for the VA. He worked for Chief of Staff Ambulatory Care, the Safety Administration, as switchboard operator. I mean, he went through a couple different jobs over there over the years. So this could happen to even an internal family. I don't work for the government. I got convicted as a felon very early on in life, so I've never had that privilege to be an employee of our government, but I am a member of the government. So, I pay taxes. My father pays taxes, and, I vote. And luckily, I'm still in a state that if you are a convicted felon, you can still vote. So, and I'm registered to vote. I signed up for selective services, whatever. And anything, my birth certificate alone puts me in as a citizen. I'm a citizen. I'm part of the government. A part of the most important and critical part of the government, the majority in a democracy, citizenship. There's more citizens than there are employees. So back to what happened was this particular area and demographics is basically Christian. And psychotronic weaponry was designed in overseas operations to encounter these very small, tight-knit terroristic cells. They're very hard to penetrate. And you think about the DEA kind of uses those. It makes sense. These little tight drug rings. They're very hard to penetrate. Not near as hard as a third world country's very religious zealot sort of radical network. But you can see the relevancy there and how it kind of makes logic sense. So they started to allow these individuals to use this type of equipment and its weaponry, but they started to let them use this type of equipment in the war on drugs to use in operations. So they started using it right here in mid-America, and it immediately got out of hand. It immediately became an incident here where they used transformational optics to make a person, quote unquote, believe they had sold their soul. There's no such thing as selling your soul. You can look in the Bible. There's no such thing as selling your soul. If you're a Christian, you can go talk to people. There is no such thing. But when you don't know what you're dealing with, and you may have been a victim of this, if you're from Clark County, Indiana, and you were in Clark County, Indiana around the time of Operation Icebreaker, and you experienced anything like what I'm about to describe, you were a victim as well, chances are. So what they did was try to get someone to do something humanly demoralizing so they wouldn't tell anybody. And they used transformational optics, and basically it is... it projects literally figures, and it works with computer-generated graphics to do these things. There's also other types of equipment. There's suits that are used and other things, but and it's played on a loop. So it looks as if something materializes right in front of you. And in this case, there was two types. One was holographic, and one was dark matter. So one had a very dark matter property. It looked basically like a shadow figure. And, anybody say, oh, man, shadow figures, man, you was on that good dope. No, this was actually transformational optics. This is a real thing you can look up and you can look into, and it's not very well known, but it's not super top secret either. And the other thing was, and I think they put magnetophosphines in the air, little particulates, and someone had made reference, I heard on a radio show that they have it at Disney, where the dragon comes off the water and comes to life in a holographic image, and it looks real. So they used a combination of these two things, and it literally appeared. It was just a still frame face, an image, but it literally looked as if there was an object there depicting, quote unquote, the devil. And I thought, what the fuck, But the other thing was the dark matter, and it had a projection to it that where it moved, and it was a little bigger. It was more scary. It was definitely scarier, I should say. And after this encounter, the psychological conditioning to a person is to, there was a reach out your hand, and there was there was this whole sort of stage, and I was hit with an acoustical weapon at that time that it rung my bell all the way through. Ring, ding, ding. It's hard to explain. It went all the way from here to here. And it really was, what the fuck? That's the neatest thing ever. And I remember somebody over at V2K Communications going, it's pretty neat, but it's not the neatest thing ever. And I thought, huh. And so I didn't take it serious at that point. And there was an inductment period there where they began to propagate to a person that they had quote unquote sold their soul. And, that after that point, everything you did, you would have to pray and be in this obedience and discipline to condition a person to have blind obedience to V2K communications. And I mean blind obedience, where you don't think for yourself. You just follow conditioned instructions. And, that use and abuse of that equipment is so counter-constitutional. It really fucks with a person's core belief system. It really goes against the morals and the values and the intended purpose for the permission of that type of weaponry to be used. It's supposed to be to gather intelligence, not to play psychotronic theatrics and comical games to be humorous and entertain yourself. There was all types of other things, very sexual nature conversations, very, very explicit.